Okay, thanks for coming tonight to hear about some common problems and hopefully potentially in your garden and how to address them with native plants. And if you've been here before, some of the introductory comments will be really familiar, but hopefully we can breeze through them and then get started with the meat of the presentation. So if you have any, hopefully since you guys are here, you guys don't have any more problems, but if you do, please reach out to us at info@wglbbo.org and we will try to troubleshoot. And calling in is always an option as well. And if you live in the greater Port Washington area, so Milwaukee area, we're finishing up our plant sale. So our pre-order plant sale is closing on April 23rd. And we're have a lot of events, activities that we would love more help on. So if you're interested in getting the word out and getting more native plants into the community, please reach out to us. We can't do any of this without a bunch of really awesome partners who help us do this really good work. And this is just a few of the key players. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these events, but we're going to be putting on a bunch more webinars, programs. We're giving away free oak trees this upcoming Saturday. And then we're doing a bunch of other programs throughout the spring and into the summer. So if you're interested and live in the area, please check out our website and we'll keep doing these webinars no matter where you guys are from. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and switch over to our presenters tonight. So first up is Jill Koonsman, who is a board member of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory, and she'll be talking today about critters and how you might be able to cope with them. And the format, I probably should have introduced this first. The format for this entire webinar is a short presentation from each of our three presenters, and then time for questions. So we have had some questions submitted by people through social media. So we'll start out with those and then turn it open to everything you guys have to ask. And feel free to type in questions as people are presenting so that you have your questions in and we'll for sure get to those. Okay, with no more ado, take it away, Jill. Jill, can other people hear Jill, or is this just me?
No, I think she's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was more interested in making sure you could see the presentation. Anyway, good evening. It's nice to be able to join with all of you. And I will be presenting on coping with the critters, which I am assuming many of you have this challenge. In fact, more and more people are faced with the disappointment of deer damage in their gardens. It is hard to feel any animosity towards a newborn fawn.
I think you might have muted yourself again accidentally.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how I managed that. So at any rate, with cute little newborn fawns, but when the lawn turns into a toddler-sized deer and gets dropped off in your hydrangea and rose patch, they're a little bit less welcome. And then, of course, toddlers have a way of turning into teenagers, and those teenagers have a big gang of friends that they bring, and they can eat you out of house and home. So although there's no sure cure for this invasion of quadrupeds, there are some strategies that can be your best line of defense, or at least I should say they're my best line of defense. They work in my yard. So I'm going to be sharing this evening with you the 5 coping strategies that I implement. So coping strategy number 1 is to create an equal opportunity lawn. I have burned my earthgrass lawn that required pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers and water and regular mowings into an equal opportunity lawn. And I did that by seeding Dutch white clover. I allowed the native violets and the wild strawberries to grow wild in this lawn. And it is now something that the pollinators are absolutely ecstatic over. And so are the rabbits and the groundhogs and the deer. They, in fact, tend to prefer my eco-friendly lawn to being involved in my flower beds. Coping strategy number 2 that I implement in my yard is having a critter-resistant ground cover. So I've listed here the types of native plants that I've used as ground covers in my yard. If you have an expanse of ground that you want to have covered with a native plant, bloodroot is a wonderful early spring blooming plant. It tends to colonize quickly. I've never had any kind of an animal bother it, but it's just a lovely pure white blossom with an interesting shaped leaf. Canadian ginger forms a nice low-growing mat with its heart-shaped leaf. Virginia bluebells, if you have a wooded area, make a really nice addition to that area, and again, colonize quickly. They bloom quite early in the season, and so they serve as a really important nectar plant for the early arriving hummingbirds and some of the insect pollinators. May apples, who doesn't love the umbrella stand looking stand of umbrellas that these May apples present? When they form a colony, it's like a beach at Coney Island with all of the beach umbrellas up. And Canadian anemone, which is one that I allow to go quite rampant in my garden. It is a happy traveler. And for that reason, instead of offering Canadian anemone at our plant sale, we are offering tall anemone, which is a little bit taller than this, but not quite as interested in traveling through your yard. But this fills a dark place with its bright, cheery white flower, and it's something that I really have enjoyed. Prairie Smoke is another wonderful plant. It is a great front of the border plant, very well behaved. It gets its name from the fact that once it's bloomed, its seed head looks like a plume of smoke. And ferns. We have lots of beautiful, beautiful native ferns in Wisconsin. This is, of course, a maidenhair fern. There's cinnamon stick fern and ostrich fern and Christmas fern. And they all serve as wonderful cover for birds. So if you've got, again, kind of a shaded area, this makes a wonderful addition to that kind of an area. And again, is not bothered at all by deer or groundhogs or any of those critters. Coping strategy number 3 is creating deeper borders. If you have joined some of these previous webinars in our series, you will probably have heard Doug Tallamy's name invoked multiple times. And from his book, Bringing Nature Home, one of the things that he advocates is creating deep borders. This mixed border that I have is deep enough and thick enough to make the critters work hard to get to their favorite treats. And in this case, The deer candy in this particular border is the pink phlox. I've planted a thick drift of Monarda diadema. I think the fact that it is quite pungent is something that protects the phlox from the deer. And Monarda diadema, by the way, also known as scarlet bee balm, is not native to Wisconsin, but it is native to North America. It's been introduced to Wisconsin and it does quite well. So this border, which was already quite deep, I have now added a border at the very front of butterfly weed, which is one of many milkweed species that is native to Wisconsin. Milkweed is the only host plant to the monarch butterfly. And you can see the monarchs flitting around in here. They will lay their eggs on this and the caterpillars hatch. And then as soon as the caterpillars have come out of their chrysalis, they have a lot of nectar plants that are handy for them to feed off of. I add butterfly weed all over my yard. So you can see at the front of this border here, there's another patch of it back here. I have it in my backyard. It's basically my entire yard has become a monarch nursery. Coping strategy number 4 is planting for the yuck factor. And what I mean by this is planting something that just, it doesn't smell good, it doesn't taste good to the deer or the other animals. And some of these plants don't necessarily have an odor that we can detect, but for some reason, the deer don't seem to enjoy it. So some of those kinds of plants belong to the onion or allium family, the sage family, the mint family. This is nodding prairie onion, which again, excellent for hummingbirds and all sorts of bee pollinators. This is a native plant border. Of course, I'm not referring to the hydrangea that are planted in the back. Those are not native shrubs. But all of the flowering plants in front of those are native plants, and they are in their 2nd year now, planted right along a deer path, and they have never been touched by the deer. So from left to right, Joe Pye weed, you can see a little bit more of the orange butterfly weed down here in the lower left corner. There is lavender hyssop, which is not only a pollinator magnet, but is really enjoyed by the finches in the late summer and early fall when it goes to seed. I also have in this bed some forked aster, which isn't in view in this particular photo. And then I have here Ohio goldenrod. I've also begun adding native plants that are deer resistant to my non-native mixed border. So the native plants that I'm beginning to mix in, here is lance-leaf coreopsis. The white is the smooth penstemon. There is primrose back here in the back right-hand corner. This sage is not a native sage, but we do have native sage in our plant sale this year, and I plan on replacing this sage with the native sage. And my final coping strategy, think big. Trees offer a wider range of biodiversity to our yards. They provide cover for the birds, and they serve as an important food source to insects that in turn provide food for baby chicks. So these are some of the trees I've planted in my yard. I have some low-lying, very wet areas where there's along a drainage ditch. Tamarack thrive there. They're a fun tree. If you aren't familiar with them, they're deciduous. In the spring, they get these bubble gum pink little cone heads. In the early spring, it takes on this very soft green color to the needles. And in the fall, over here on the far right, the needles turn a kind of a buttery golden color before they fall. So a plant that I really enjoy, or a tree that I enjoy. I am now planting more and more redbud in my yard rather than planting lilacs and crabapple trees because it is a native plant and has the benefits that the native trees bring. And it does not seem to be bothered by the deer. St. John's wort, wonderful shrub, again, deer resistant, an absolute beehive of activity, literally, in July when it is in full bloom. I plant this on the perimeter of my vegetable garden because it blocks the deer from entering. And in addition, because it is such a strong pollinator magnet, I find that I end up with bumper crops of cucumbers and squash because of its location. And then there are the really, really, really large native plants that aren't shrubs and aren't trees, but are so big you'd think they were a shrub. This is a runcus or goat's beard and black cohosh, which is in my yard is at the back of the border. It grows to be about 7 foot tall. Again, deer don't bother it. It does not need staking. And it provides a really important late summer source of nectar for the migrating hummingbirds and for the monarchs, generation 5 that is headed back down to Mexico. So I highly recommend this. Also has a very delicate light fragrance, which is delightful. And this is one of my must-have plants in the garden that I recommend to anybody who loves monarchs. I have this scattered throughout my yard, but on one plant, which this is, just one plant, I have counted way above 30 monarchs at one time. This is definitely a favorite nectaring plant of monarchs. So I've made a little list here. I know that this is being recorded and there'll be a link to it so you can go back in and pull up this list if you are interested in it. But this is a list of the deer resistant plants in our plant sale and a list of the deer resistant shrubs in our plant sale. And our apologies, some of these unfortunately sold out already, but if you don't see it listed on the website, you will know that it has been sold out. And then we also have a Dodge the Deer Pocket Garden kit, which has 4 different species of plants that are very deer resistant. So, and with that, I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Jill. So next up is Bill Volkert. And just to plug those recordings, if you didn't hear his first presentation to start off the NHIP webinar series, I highly recommend it. It was a great presentation. And we asked him to come back and answer a few more questions and try to address a few invasive related problems that people might have. So, Bill, you should now be the presenter.
Okay. I did not develop an entirely new presentation for this. Well, quite honestly, I've been very tied up with trying to finish up a book writing project, so I put so many other things aside. But I will repeat a little bit of some of the things from my presentation. And to begin with, I guess I should just mention that I think for any gardener, whether you've worked with vegetables or or a small flower garden of any type, weeds have always been a problem. And so, you know, there's always that need with any garden to give the advantage to the things you want and to keep out the things you don't want. From an ecological point of view, the newer problem is invasive species. And this is, of course, the non-native species that are known to be not only aggressive like any weed can be, but to the point of invading our native wild areas and suppressing and even dominating those sites to the detriment of our native vegetation, and in many cases also having detrimental impacts to the wildlife that find much more of the food and even shelter that they require in the native plants that they always grew up in or lived with. So whether you're really dealing with, say, a small flower garden, a prairie planting, trying to manage a woodland stand, you're going to have some sort of invasive plant problem. And I think the list is probably growing all the time. And I'm a little concerned, maybe for those people who are concerned, who are really working hard to maintain either their own backyard or to volunteer in natural areas, of a sense of fatigue of the new weed of the month. There's some new things that keep coming up that are coming in just because we're such a mobile society. But there are some that we've been fighting for a long time, and of course some new ones that have been showing up. The most important thing, though, is to first learn to identify them, and not only to know what's good, what's bad, and this of course gives you a better appreciation of the plants that you are growing, to get to recognize them and to know what the ones that you desire, how well they're doing, but then also to recognize the ones you don't want and get them out. And I think the most important thing for invasives is try to get to recognize them very early on. And the faster you can get on top of them and remove them and keep them from becoming a real dominant, the much better off you're going to be. If you already have them established, well, then you're just going to have to get on top of it and try to remove that, knock it back, get it under control, so you give that open space once again to the native plants you desire. So I'll mention a couple of different plants in some of the communities, but from the presentation I gave last time, I just want to review a few things here. This was in our land as we were working on the woodland restoration. We had a heavy dominance of honeysuckle, and that's was certainly brought in by the birds. And the other problem was that this was a grazed woodlot, so essentially there was a trampling and eating or suppression of the native plants, opening up the chance for an invasive shrub like this. So we had to get in and just cut, first of all, to make a trail, and then to remove it from each side and just open that up. Find that honeysuckle is actually fairly easy to remove. The biggest ones, you're going to have to use a chainsaw to really cut the extremely old ones. Otherwise, they don't have a real deep root. They're more lateral, and it's usually about 2 or 3 that spread out in different directions, and they can just be pulled out. And either with a grub hoe, using a mattock to whack down at the bottom and remove it, or a weed wrench, depending on the size, of course, and the type of manpower it's going to need, or the real small ones can even be hand pulled. And so we had such a dominance of them to remove it, we ended up with huge piles as we were cutting them and removing them out of the woods. And in order to just burn up all the dead material we had hauled out, we had to create a bonfire of it and actually not burn it all at once, because there was just such a massive amount of it. What happened here in our land was we kind of took our eye off the ball, and we did not, as we got busy with other projects, we didn't realize how quickly the buckthorn was starting to invade. And so you can see here just how that had grown in that understory. And this is a very common problem. I think everybody should know buckthorn by now. It's probably public enemy #1 on the invasive list. And this one can be quite problematic because obviously it's very prolific in terms of its seed production. It grows quite easily in a variety of conditions, and it can really dominate not only by shading out plants, but like a number of these, it produces an allelopathic chemical. In other words, it exudes from the roots a chemical that inhibits other plants, just like walnuts do, probably the most common example. And so in a sense, it almost sterilizes the soil. Now, both of these plants, you don't want to just cut the honeysuckle or cut buckthorn or any of the woody vegetation. The problem there is that if you cut it, it's just going to come back with, instead of 1 stem, it'll come back with 5 or 10. So you do need to actually either grub out the root or pull out. And buckthorn, of course, has a much more fibrous root, a little bit deeper, and even a plant that's only, say, a little more than waist high can have a pretty deep root. And you also have to make a decision how much you want to disturb the soil. Larger ones, you're not going to be able to rip much. You're going to have to cut it and chemically treat the stump of it. And of course, this is a fairly selective use then of chemical, only applied right to that stump. Honeysuckle, by the way, is easily treated with Roundup, but buckthorn, that will not work on it. You need something like Garlon 4 or Element 4, one of the stump treatments. And by the way, I know Tordon is another stump treatment that's readily available. I would be careful with that one because it really moves through the soil, and through the root systems, and it's not going to kill the plants that you want, but oftentimes may kill or really injure other plants nearby, especially woody vegetation. If you're looking for really good advice on some of the different chemical use, I found that the farm co-ops, because they do deal with a variety of different herbicides and they are certified, they're usually pretty good at telling you what, as far as recent research, is fairly effective and what works, and of course how to reduce the amount of use you have on it. So I went in and I did the cutting and treating. The biggest ones was with a chainsaw, then here's with a pruners and chemical glove and a spray bottle on the other hand, or we even use a dabber to just apply the chemical right on the root. Once I get the bigger ones out, this is my smaller hand mattock or grub hoe, like a little hatchet, and in a fairly loose soil. It works well in a woodland. It's not that effective, say, in a prairie stand where you've got a lot of dense root and sod, because it's just so much tangled up. It's really hard to try to get into there and remove that fibrous root of the woody material and cut through all the roots of the other vegetation. But in a woodland, this is very effective. And here also is the larger grub hoe, and I just give a single whack down at the root and just pry that out, and you can work pretty quickly at that. Number of different techniques depending on how dense your stand is and how old the plants are. My strategy generally is I work around the outside of the densest stand. So if I'm going to put an hour, I clear a large area where they're not so thick. I move in, kind of corral them to the last thickest area. And then once I get there, I start cutting out, of course, the biggest ones first, so we're not producing fruit, and take that size class down. And then after I've cut and treated, I'll follow up sometime later and do the grubbing for the small ones and clear that out. So that's my technique. Here's an area we remove the bigger ones. We still have an understory of it. Once that's all taken out, this is now the restored understory in fall time of the oak hickory woods. And right now, this time of year, we've got, after removing all of the buckthorn and honeysuckle, a really wonderful display of hepaticas. They were just at peak bloom with the last warm weather. Spring beauties were flowering very heavily. Fawn lilies coming in. So we're really seeing a lot of the first early wildflowers that have now taken over because we've given the space and removed the competition. What we do have is nearby, of course, like other people, garlic mustard is showing up in our neighborhood. There again, I'm trying to get it under control. And we find that, first of all, if the seed is allowed to drop in any place, it remains viable in the soil for about 5 to 7 years. So you're going to have to stay on it every single year to make sure none of those plants ever produce seed, and do that 5 years or plus in a row to finally expend that whole seed bank that's in the soil. Another thing that's effective, it is a 2-year plant. So for garlic mustard, you can use a blowtorch, and just simply the first year plants in late spring or early summer, just simply torch them. Of course, you got to watch for how much leaf litter you have and have some sort of control in case, say, dry leaves catch on fire. So just a flapper would work very well, just to kind of slap out or put out those flames anywhere. But that's another very effective technique to knock it back. Another plant that we're seeing again in our neighborhood, Japanese hedge parsley. It's another very problematic one, and it's known to be very explosive in terms of the prolific growth. And here we're trying to, again, detect it very early, get on top of it, and stay on top of it to make sure it never becomes seriously established. I don't think that work is going to end as long as there's a seed stock and a resource somewhere in the neighborhood where it's going to come in from, but I'm not going to give it a chance to get established here. And I've been working with neighbors to try to help them to identify it and even work with them to remove it on their property. So we're never going to get rid of those invasive plants, but we do need to manage them and control them. And one of the more common models that people have used for invasive plants or any other invasive species establishment is the fire model. In other words, if you're going to fight a fire, you want to get on it when it's just a little campfire, and before it gets into a raging full-blown forest fire or crown fire where it's now all but out of control. And so early detection is going to be important. Now that's, of course, I know challenging for a landowner who maybe is new to wildflower gardening. how do you learn to identify the things you put in and the ones that you really want to grow? How do you get to recognize at the same time these invasives and recognize them early enough when they're small and you can still deal with them? And unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't recognize these plants until they're established and are a problem. And then it's, gee, I got a lot of this stuff. What is it? And then, uh-oh, what do I do about it? So good sharing of information, good experience. This is certainly going to help. And I'm hoping whether it's workshops like this or anything else, these are all going to be sources of good information to help people. So here's our little buckthorn. This is actually a resprout. You can see the root got snapped. There's 2 stems coming off of it. But this is what I look for nowadays, is the very smallest ones that were either broken off the fall before or the seeds that have just germinated that have come in, and again, never get it a chance to establish. And in some places, my wife, we're actually pulled back the leaves after we removed it, and we're spreading wildflower seeds in to take those place and try to hurry up a little bit with the reestablishment of the native vegetation. So with that, I would suggest that people get familiar with some of the more problematic plants that they may have to deal with, learn to identify them. In your prairies, there's plants there again that can become established. And I mentioned this in my presentation of a month or so ago. And I know the question also came up online about rosinweed and a few other plants. We have been working with establishing and managing prairies now for 35 years. And we started early enough where this was rather experimental. And we have learned over the years there are some plants that are just not that compatible in relatively small sites. So what we have found is that for some of these, there are some plants maybe you just shouldn't be putting in there, and rosinweed's one of those. When you look back at the original prairies, when these things spanned hundreds and hundreds of miles, even the most aggressive plants couldn't take over everything. But when you've got something that's a relatively small area, some plants just don't behave well and become quite dominant there. And I think some of this stuff we're still learning as we go along with native landscaping. But there are some plants that basically just don't play well, especially in small sites. So it's the best I can offer at this point, and as an overview. I guess the last community would be, of course, wetlands, and I think most people are familiar with purple loosestrife, and of course, reed canary grass, as also the Phragmites, giant reed grass, are the biggest problems in moist soil areas. So I will stop at this point, and we can turn it over to the next presenter, and we'll just wait for the questions then for later on during discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And I'll turn it over next to Danielle Bell. Again, if you missed her presentation during the last webinar, it was great. I think a really great intro to establishing native plantings in your yard. And I would really, if you didn't see that one, I would really recommend you look at that too. And now I'll switch over to her.
All right, thanks, Jen. So we all had some really good presentations already, and I'm going to follow up with talking about clay soils. A lot of us in Southeast Wisconsin are dominated by clay soils. Not everybody, we have a few pockets, especially if you're in the Kettle Moraine areas where we had some of the glacial till falling in, but most of us were that ancient lake bed where all the silt and everything settled out, and so now we have lovely clay that we are dealing with and working to plant into. So there are actually some benefits of clay soil. A lot of people think of it as a negative thing to have on your property, but it's actually, it holds a lot of nutrients in there because it's chemically, the particles are charged, so they actually hold on to a lot of nutrients. So it's really nutrient rich and also holds a lot of moisture. But with holding a lot of moisture, it can also fill up with water and actually be waterlogged for a long period of time because those particles are so small that the water can't infiltrate in between them and get down into the water table. And then the opposite, when it dries out, it becomes hard as a rock, and it is very difficult to do anything with once it gets to that point, and you have to wait until we get some moisture, and usually we'll get a big dumping of rain, and then that's when more issues start to happen with erosion and runoff, because the ground is so hard that it can't actually absorb any of that water. So one thing that we can do, we want to prevent it from becoming compacted. And so when we do a lot of earth moving and things like that for new buildings and new development, that is where clay becomes the hardest, because we're moving it around, we're compacting it, and then we're not letting that infiltration be there because we've put heavy machinery over it and moved it around so much. So how are we going to deal with these clay soils? One way to do it is to plant native plants. Because these species have evolved to thrive in the clay soils, they are going to survive in them. So that's the number one thing. A lot of people have struggled with planting into clay soil. That's because they're planting exotic plants that are not adapted to our clay soils here in Wisconsin. So starting with native plants is your number one way to achieve excellence in getting a garden to thrive. Also using mulch, whether that's hardwood mulch or if you're using ground cover plants, the green mulch, that will prevent the soil from drying out and becoming that rock hard surface that the water doesn't infiltrate into or anything. So if we can protect the soil from being desiccated by the sun, then we're going to prevent it from drying out, and the plants will be able to absorb it and use that nutrients that is in there being held in by the soil particles. Also adding organic matter, whether that's, initially you want to add in some organic matter with compost or leaf mold, but also just leaving the leaves, in the fall. Instead of doing that fall cleanup, we can leave the leaves, let that organic matter break down from the decomposers and the microbes that are in your property and in your soil, and then that will benefit the soil, the clay, and break it up and start to mix with it. Those earthworms, not so much jumping worms, but the other earthworms that we have there and other microbes are actually moving that organic matter down into the soil and doing the mixing that we would be doing if we were tilling to prepare a bed. So if we just let nature do it, it takes a little bit longer, but it will actually get better. And then, on a smaller scale, the preventing of compaction. So if you're walking on your property, you're driving a vehicle, try to stay in the same path so you're only compacting that area and you're not compacting all your area. And that will allow the other areas that you're not constantly walking on or driving on, then you'll let the water infiltrate better, and the mixing of the soil with the plant roots and things like that. So next, I'm just going to talk through a couple native plants that I would recommend to start with. And these are by no means the only ones that will grow in clay soils. These are just kind of my favorite go-to plants that I would like to put in, and I usually go to as my default when I'm starting with a really tough site. And I know that it's going to be heavy clay. It's been lawn, so it's been compacted by lawnmowers constantly every other week during the summer. So we want to start getting something in there that's going to start mixing the soil and start encouraging that new nice loam in the ultimate goal that we're looking for. So Jill already talked about Prairie Smoke a little bit. It's a really nice early flowering plant. It's flowering right now, really good for those queen bumblebees that are emerging. It's really low to the ground, so all they got to do is just fly a couple inches up and they have a pollen source right away. It's also deer resistant, like Jill mentioned. It's drought tolerant, so it can handle some of those denser clay soils when they get dried out. And it's also salt tolerant, which is another plus. So this is a really good edge bordering plant. Stays nice and low. It does form a ground cover. It'll start spreading by rhizomes. So it gives that green mulch aspect that I mentioned earlier. So it's a kind of a good all around good plant to have in your yard. And here's another taller one that's going to be more of a shrub almost kind of look. It's the white indigo. There's also a blue indigo too. So both of those are kind of similar in appearance, and they both are deer resistant. They both tolerate being wet and dry. They also tolerate the clay soils that we're talking about, and it's a really nice accent plant that you can put in. Takes a couple years to really get established, but once it does, it's going to be there for the long haul. It'll send a deep taproot down, and no drought is going to really bother it too much. Really nice stature, and also adds some winter interest in with its seed pods throughout the winter. They'll rattle in the wind and just kind of add that extra texture during the winter when everything else is dormant. And the bumblebees this is another great plant for them. They're strong enough to get in to the flower petals and actually get to the nectar source inside. So really good plant. Hummingbirds will also go to it as well. This one, if you want to have one native plant in your yard, I would say this is probably one of them for pollinators, our bergamot. And it is just covered with bees and all sizes, bumblebees, solitary bees, sweat bees, everybody kind of goes to this, butterflies as well, hummingbirds. This is the one plant that I always find rusty patch bumblebees on. Not to say it's the only one that they're going after, but this is a really good plant. It'll fill in, it'll naturalize really well. I do tell people to use it with caution. Maybe put 1 or 2 plants in first and let it kind of fill in then, because it will seed itself pretty easily. So you only need to introduce 1 or 2 plants to your property, and after a couple years, you'll start to see it pop up in other areas on its own. So you don't have to waste the money getting it planted right away. You can kind of let nature do its thing and let it fill in on its own. Again, because it's a part of the mint family, it's aromatic, so it does have that deer resistance. So that's another nice thing about it filling in amongst your other plants, is that, you know, it adds that benefit of being deer resistant. But this stuff will grow in any kind of soil conditions. It likes to be wet, it likes to be dry. It will be taller in wetter areas, and then once it gets to that drier, less favorable condition for it, then it'll be a little bit shorter in stature, but it still will bloom. It'll still do all the benefits that we need it to do. And then to give a shout out to our monarchs, we have the swamp milkweed. This one does well. It is a short-lived perennial, so we do need to let it reseed. If you're a gardener who likes to cut down their plants in the fall just for a little tidier appearance, this one we need to let it reseed because it's only going to live for a couple years on its own. So let it reseed, let it fill in, do its thing. It's a food source for the monarch caterpillars, but there's so many other species that use the flowers as a nectar source and a pollen source. If you're a fan of wasps, which most people aren't, but they're really cool, especially the solitary ones, this is another magnet for those guys. So if you're interested in attracting some wasps, which are also good good bugs to have in your garden, good predators that will help keep other insects in check, this is a good plant to have in your yard for that reason too. It's a wetland plant, so it's tolerant of having its feet wet. It's a good rain garden plant if you have that area in your yard that stays a little bit wet more often. This is a plant that you can put in that will do well. Hummingbirds will go to it. Yeah, kind of an overall good. It's got a really nice bright red, purple, magenta color. And then it also has a really interesting fall color too, the smaller photo, if you can see that. It does get some nice fall color as it goes into dormancy. This is another one that Jill also mentioned, nodding onion. This guy, just like that Monarda, will grow in anything. It's a really nice edge species too for the border, similar to the Prairie Smoke. And it's nice and short in stature, gets to only be about 2, maybe 3 feet tall with the flower. It greens up really early in the spring, which is nice. Gets you that color right away. It's pretty much almost full grown right now, at least in my yard. And then the flowers will shoot up later in the summer, probably towards the end of summer, early fall. Bees are attracted to this. I find a lot of male bees in the fall spending the night on these flowers. That's the place I always go to check them out because they don't go back to the hive. So it's a good place they can hide in amongst all those little flowers and wait out the night until temperatures get warm enough for them to fly around. It's another one similar to Monarda that will self-seed. This one doesn't travel as much, I feel, because it is shorter though. So you'll just see it fill in amongst itself, whereas the Monarda kind of will go with the wind because it's taller. So that one kind of jumps from area to area. This will just kind of self-seed. Again, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of money putting it in, just put in a couple plants, let it get established, and you can even cut the seed heads off and sprinkle it in other areas to kind of direct it into certain areas that you want it to be in for the design of your landscape. But it's a really easy one to start from seed. So if you don't want to get plants either, you can always start this one from seed and just sow it, and they will be up the next year. And then going into our fall flowering plants, the sky blue aster is one of my favorite asters, especially for smaller landscapes that, we don't want to have too aggressive of plants, kind of like Bill was saying, there's some species we want to stay away from. Sky blue aster, it does like to be a little bit drier, but it will handle that clay soil. So maybe not in the wettest part of your property, but it will take the clay soils. I like it because it's very light in stature, where it will intermingle. The stems of the flowers will be in between each other. So in this picture with the cone flowers and the black-eyed Susans, it kind of mixes in between there. So it's a really good blending plant in that sense. Really good nectar source in the late season for those bees as they're starting to overwinter, and the monarchs as they're heading south. So really good source of nectar, pollen for those late season, and also drought tolerant, like I said. And then the seed heads, like most of our asters and goldenrods, are nice and poofy. So that's interesting winter interest that you can have throughout the fall and into winter. And then also I have through a grass in here. Switchgrass is a really nice taller grass that does well in clay. Again, another one that's both drought tolerant and can handle wetter conditions. Grasses are really good for remediating clay soil because they have such a fibrous root system that as the roots grow down into the soil, they help to break up all those particles, and they find their way in there and loosen up the soil. And then as their roots die, just like we lose hair every so often, plants will lose their root hairs and the root fibers. So then those channels then allow the water to infiltrate down. So when we have these grasses, it's a nice way to get that soil to start turning over and start to get more organic matter into the soil and alleviate a lot of that clay density. There's a lot of cultivars of this one, so if you wanted to have one that's a little bit more redder, something like that, you can, but the straight species is also really good for any home landscape. And then the birds love these for the seeds throughout the winter. And it stays upright pretty well and holds its structure for winter interest. A really good backdrop in your landscape beds where you have the other flowers in front of it. It's a nice backdrop that way, and to break up, the monotony of some of your plantings. So these were just a few examples. I focused mainly on herbaceous plants, but there's also trees and shrubs that are clay tolerant as well. And like I said, these are by no means the only ones that you can plant in clay, but these are kind of the top ones that I go to. And as you start getting things in, try stuff. It's not to say, if it says this doesn't work in clay, that doesn't mean you can't try it. Try one or two, see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, then you didn't invest a lot of money into it and you can try something else. But these are kind of the good ones to start with, and you can always add more in. So that's all I have for this presentation.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So everybody, please submit any questions or feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. But I'm going to start out with some that were submitted online to get us started, and then I hope to hear from you guys. So for Jill, someone asked that something is eating birdseed out of their feeder at night. Do you have any advice on how to reduce amount of birdseed going to mammals? Jill, I think you're muted again.
Sorry about that. I seem to be the chronic mute person who's on mute. Yes, there are a number of different kinds of animals that could be eating birdseed at night. Raccoons would be at the top of my list as the potential culprit. Deer might be another. And so depending on how you hang your bird feeder might determine which of these animals you need to be focused on addressing. So if it's a raccoon, what I do on my bird feeders is I get a baffle, which does not allow the raccoon to crawl up to the bird feeder, and that seems to keep them excluded quite well. There are different sized baffles. There's one that excludes chipmunks and squirrels, and then a larger baffle that will exclude the raccoon. So being a nighttime disappearance of the seed, I would suggest get a raccoon baffle. There are also bird feeders that are weight triggered. There's one that I have that's called the Eliminator, so that if anything heavy grabs onto the feeder part, it shuts off the supply of seed. If it's a deer going after your bird feeder, you need to hang it higher so that it's actually out of the reach of the deer. And finally, last resort, if all of that fails, I hate to say this, but bring the bird feeders in every night. That's another alternative.
Thanks. So Bill, I think you've been really good at getting to the questions as people have been asking them. So if you have more questions for Bill, please submit them, but I'll move on to some that were submitted for Danielle. Do you have any recommendations for establishing plants in dry clay?
Yeah, I would say, one thing you can do is you can start with doing some soil amendments. So bringing in some compost. I know in my backyard, I have a bunch of silver maples that they really suck a lot of the moisture out, and I get that really dry clay. And leaving the leaves. So wherever you want to put a bed in the future, leave the leaves in that area, let them start breaking down throughout the winter, and do that for a couple years. You may not be able to get to plant things right away, but if you start establishing it that way, it gets that organic matter built back up, especially if you have an area where it's been mowed a lot, or it has been kind of neglected. Starting to add that organic matter in before you start planting is a way to do it. Otherwise, starting with some of those tough ones, like I said, that, nodding onion and Monarda, some of those that are tough, that will grow anywhere, that are almost weedy in some people's mind. Starting with those guys, because those roots will start to do something. They'll start turning, they'll start attracting the microbes and everybody in there. So getting that organic matter built up in with the clay soil is your best way to start. And if you want to speed it up, you can do it with adding your own compost, if you don't want to wait for nature to do its thing.
Sounds good. Jill, do you have any advice on plantings that keep groundhogs away or at bay?
Oh, groundhogs are a real challenge. Sometimes they're as difficult as deer to cope with. I would say that my best success was actually this year with the eco-friendly lawn that I had an image of in the beginning of my presentation. They seem to really enjoy the clover and the violet leaves, and tend to actually be out there eating that rather than going into the flower beds. So sometimes it's a matter of, that old saying, bait and switch. It's getting them to be more attracted to something else. And I've actually seen groundhogs eat Monarda. So even the things that the deer tend to be less interested in, the groundhogs will go after. But yeah, I think the Dutch white clover lawn was I had my groundhog damage really diminished greatly.
I would guess this is probably to Danielle, but maybe multiples people can address this. Can blue stem grass handle clay soils?
Yeah, I have a little blue stem in my yard. I'm in Glendale, so we're kind of, smack in the middle, and it does well. I wouldn't say it's thriving terribly, because they do like to be a little bit drier and less compacted. I do think Bill said that big blue stem is another one that can do well. I would say if you have a drier site, would be better than wet. So if you have clay but it's a little bit drier, then you would be better with the little blue stem. Big blue stem, that one's another one that will kind of grow anywhere. So you might have better luck with that, but it's a little bit taller of a species. So a few accent plants would be good.
And then this is again for Danielle. Are there any plants that you mentioned that are shade tolerant?
Yeah, so I would say most of them, some of them will be. I had mainly focused on sunny plants. But the nodding onion, that one will grow in partial shade. I seeded some of that in areas where it's underneath a tree and you don't get as many flowers, and that's kind of the alternative. You know, it still thrives and it's still green, but you won't get as many flowers if you do it in shade. But a lot of the ones that Jill mentioned, you know, the ginger, wild strawberries, a really good ground cover that would do well in shade. That black cohosh will also do well in shade. Yeah, that's another one that people always think, oh, I have a lot of shade, I don't have anything that will grow here. And that's, you know, a poor excuse, because there's a lot of great woodland plants that will do well. And again, mostly things will survive in shade, they just won't flower as much. So if you can put them on the edge, you know, you'll get more flowers out of them that way.
So we got a new question for Jill. Does white clover spread too readily from the yard into your flower beds?
I am very conscientious about edging all of my beds, so I don't have a problem with that. And I also mulch my beds. And so between the mulching and the edging, it seems to keep the clover at bay.
Okay. And then let's see. One question that we got online was, people have seen different reviews of how deer and rabbit resistant plants are. Do you have any advice on how to make sense of different accounts that people might find online or other places?
I'm sorry, is that the question for me?
I guess. Yeah, sure.
Could you repeat, please?
Sorry. If people are reading different accounts that say how deer, that one say a certain given plant is more or less deer resistant, but I guess how do you make sense of different accounts where one account may say that a plant is more deer resistant than another says it's not?
Yeah, you know, I think that's something where people need to experiment. Then we can actually, you and I have shared an experience of one of the plants that is planted right along my deer path that the deer turn their nose up at, which is Ohio goldenrod. You planted it last fall and they ate it. So I think deer are like people. They all have their own personalities and their own quirks. You just have to experiment. But, you know, if you go with a general rule of thumb that something that's aromatic, or something that is generally listed as a deer resistant plant, you know, I think you just have to try it out. So that's part of the fun of gardening, is experimenting and learning, right?
Exactly. Okay, so I think that I skipped a couple of questions that I think you guys addressed, but if the people who are asking those questions feel that the speakers did not fully address your question, please reach out to us and we'll make sure that your question gets answered by the speakers after. And unless people want to unmute and ask their own question, I think we might wrap up. But please.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question of Bill.
Go ahead.
I've got some briars from a previous landowner. I think there might be blackberry or something that are invaded my lawn, and I'd like to get rid of those and turn that area into kind of a native prairie for pollinators. How do you get rid of these briars with all the stickers, and they grow real dense? Do you use the tool that you showed in one of your photos?
I have the wild raspberry in my woods, and it's not always growing where I want it. It's not real deeply rooted. Again, you're going to find in woodland area without a sod that they're easier to grow out than they are among, you know, a heavier sod or plant growth. Yeah, in full sun they can get pretty thick. A suggestion, I haven't dealt with it myself this way, but you may want to just cut it back first so that you're not in the middle of all that barbed wire, and try to get down to that shorter plant and see if you can't grub out that root. See how well established it is, see how much labor that really entails. But I've done that for, say, multiflora rose. cut that back so you're not in the middle of all that tangle. It's not hooking you, and then you can get down in there and grub out the root system.
Okay,
And that avoids chemicals, of course, but it's manual labor.
that sounds good. I'll try that. Thank you.
And then I did get one more question that was submitted to as the organizer, asking, Jill, what plant did you refer to as the monarch magnet?
Oh, well, there are a couple of them, but the one that I love the most is the Joe Pye weed. That one will always collect a multitude of, I've had 30 plus monarchs on one bush at a time. But another great one is the lavender hyssop, is one that brings in, and that one has the additional advantage of the finches really love the seed heads.
And then we also got one more question asking, I have a wild grass area that I want to put in native plants. What is the best way to get rid of the grass first? So maybe for Bill?
Yeah, this is one of the problems I think a lot of people have when they want to try to plant a prairie. I've had some people tell me, well, I'll just stop mowing and just let it go natural. Well, you're going to end up with a weed patch. The other problem is people sometimes get a little impatient and they'll do a little bit of a treatment, put in the plants, and it's going to be a lot harder to treat your weeds when your good plants are already growing and you got to work around it. The first most important step is to get a really good, a proper preparation of the site. And whether that is through a shallow tilling for a couple of seasons or is through a no-till seeding and just simply spray. One of the problems if you kill everything, don't till the soil because now you bring up that dormant seed bank. So site preparation is going to be the most important thing. Get rid of the weeds first and get that under control so you give the best advantage to what you're going to plant in there. And that's probably the biggest mistake most people have made, and I've seen a number of failures where people have just not done it properly or been in too much of a rush. Or we had somebody actually did just a spraying of a site for 2 full years, did a really good job, and then decided to till it. And of course, had an eruption of the dormant seeds again. So yeah, there's a couple of choices, either through mechanical control, just of tilling it, but don't do that on a slope, obviously, because of erosion, or through spraying and get rid of everything else first and then convert it.
And then
and a question I also see is, can invasives be controlled with fire? Yeah, not a lot of them. Now, the one thing with fire is, first of all, you need to have a pretty good fuel source. So in a prairie where you've got a lot of dense grasses, that carries a good flame. You can get a pretty good heat. In woods, trying to do it in dry leaves, you can get a burn in an oak forest, and I've done that. But when you get something that's woody, you're never going to get enough of the heat around there to really kill it. You may top kill it, but the root will live. It'll come back again for another day. So fire has somewhat limited use, certainly in woodland, and even for some plants in prairies. When your woody vegetation gets to be too mature, your fires are just never going to be able to kill it either. So you've got to do it when they're still fairly young. So yes, it can, but has its limitations.
And then a new question for Jill, I think. Can you mow a lawn with clover, violets, etc.?
Yes, you can. I do not mow my lawn as often, but you absolutely can mow it. I normally try to wait until the clover seed heads form, because I feel then if I mow it at that time, those seed heads go back down into the soil and regerminate.
And then Bill, can you repeat what the recommended chemical for buckthorn and how would you recommend applying it?
Okay, for buckthorn, Roundup does not work on it. So you need to use, and we found that Garlon 4, or also sold under the name of Element 4, that is the most effective. And 2 techniques to get application right on the stump itself, either a chemical glove and a spray bottle, but then you have to watch a little bit of how much overspray and not too much of a jet that it comes back at you, or a little sponge-like dabber in a bottle, and just to dab it on, and that would be directly. It can be a little bit intensive work when there's a heavy stand. You got to dab every one of them. Works well with two people because you want to have one person cutting and then somebody else with the chemical gloves protect themselves and then follow up immediately and dab that right onto the freshly cut plant. Now, the important thing is wait a little bit right now, because now the sap is coming up. It will not absorb that chemical into the stem. Wait till it's fully leafed out, or again in fall is very effective when it's taking the energy back down into the roots. Springtime, you've got to do it before the sap flows. We're past that already, or once we get into summer and you've got full leaf out.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks everybody. So I second everyone who said thanks to the presenters, and this was a great presentation from all of you. And thanks Bill and Danielle for coming back, and thanks for Jill for coming out for the first time. And unless anybody has any last questions, I'll call it a night. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and good luck with your landscaping. Bye.
Yes.